and welcome to our talk tonight, which is titled, Your Teenager Broke Your Purim Rules, Now What? Okay, your teenager broke your Purim rules. You had a set of house rules that you discussed about curfew, about being responsible with drinking on or off, smoking, other issues with a responsible or not in terms of your guidelines for them. Now what? So obviously this came about as a result of many questions that were posted to me today, messaging and otherwise, what my recommendation would be in the event that children didn't follow the house rules on Purim. So obviously there's never one size fits all. I thought it would be helpful though to go through some guidelines to help you be able to parent your way through this. Think in terms of variables first of all, and how did you find out about it? I'm just going to start by asking a few questions, and I think the answer to those questions should help determine what your response ought to be. So how did you find out about it? Did the child tell you that they did something wrong? They didn't listen to your rules, or was it something that you found out? How old is your child? Obviously you're going to deal with a 10-year-old or a 15-year-old differently than an adult, or someone who's an adolescent who's close to adulthood. Were there natural consequences? I'm going to break it down and go through these. Were there natural consequences, which is something I spoke about in today's parenting club? Meaning, did your child suffer a consequence as a direct result of what happened? In other words, were they embarrassed? Did they feel a great sense of loss and pain as a result of what happened? In other words, if your child, let's say, got drunk, and it was relatively mild, your son or daughter, they were able to make it home, and they didn't really suffer any consequences from it. So then a consequence of yours is in order. However, if it was something that deeply humiliated them, that they lost control of what they were doing, that they got violently sick, and there was a natural consequence, my parenting club today, my message to parents, I would encourage you to think about the fact that in the event that there was a natural consequence, don't step on the message and distract from the consequence. In other words, ideally there should be a consequence. If one was generated already, built on that. What was the level of danger? So there are so many variables. The most important takeaway for parents, I think, would be, first of all, that there should be a consequence. You're the parent, and it's not helpful to your children to just be their friend and not enforce any rules at home. That's not helpful. On the other hand, I would encourage you to think of being an authoritative parent rather than authoritarian. I did go through the 4 parenting styles several times during our parenting clubs over at Bright Beginnings Forum. Meaning, is it something that you discuss together with the children? Again, being authoritative parent means that you're having discussions with your children. You are the boss. It doesn't mean you're giving up the ownership of your house rules and your sacred role as a parent to teach the children right from wrong, to help them develop a moral compass. That's extremely important. But it's not that you're authoritarian where it's all about your rules and it's about enforcing them on the kids. One of the things that I've been talking about a great deal is the concept of being a supervisor or a mentor, and where you see that relationship going with your child. They're totally different experiences. A mentor is someone, I was fortunate to have some great mentors in my life. A mentor is someone that you go to for guidance. A mentor is someone that you're comfortable discussing issues or challenges that you have. And a great mentor helps you figure things out for yourself rather than just telling you what to do. So, like, how do you see yourself in your relationship with your children? I propose to you that in today's environment, and again, it's something I've been thinking about a lot and talking about a great deal, that if you are only supervising your child and you're making rules and it's all about your rules and you know, in today's environment, the kids can have access to so much information and so much freedom that you might find yourself not being able to guide them much because you just don't know what's going on in their lives. So it's all about that balance and about helping your kids figure it out. Ultimately, again, what you're trying to really get to is a longer-term goal where your children develop a sense of right and wrong, and they can talk to you about what's really going on. So let's go through some of the variables that I mentioned. Again, how did you find out? So if I propose that if your child confided in you, then a discussion is in order. You know, you might want to change their house rules a bit until they're you're comfortable that they're making better decisions. But I would suggest that a punishment is not in order if a child confided in you in a way that you would not have found out. It doesn't mean, that I'm laughing, but it doesn't mean that your kid got busted and you would have found out anyway. Let's say a teacher, a faculty member at school, another parent saw your child in a way that your parent, you would have figured it out anyway. So the fact that they told you, it's better than not telling you, but it's not really full disclosure. It's not really what we're talking about. So if a child comes and confides in you and said, Mom, Dad, I really lost it. I drank too much, and then you sit down and talk about it. So what did you learn from it? What are your takeaways? And that is a process. The consequence. I got a question from one of our folks on. What's the difference between consequence and punishment? We know that punishments don't work long term and are not healthy. So that's excellent. So in the broader sense, who was that? Penny, I believe. So in the broader sense, a punishment is something that's not logical. It's not a logical outcome of what happened. You're the boss. You have the right to make, to ground your kids or to punish them in some other way, but does it make sense to your child? I'll give you one example between a consequence and a punishment, and it's with younger children, not in such serious topics, but the concept is the same. So if you have two children fighting in a play space of yours, you have a playroom for the kids. Downstairs in the playroom or in your living room, dining room, upstairs in the common spaces. So your kids, two children of yours are fighting, and you say, "Kids, go to your room. You're punished." There's been no logical connection. How does going to the room solve this? So you could do the exact same thing, framing it in a way that it's logical. So you could tell your children, "Look, this play area that we have in the house is meant for everybody to share. So you kids are not sharing it well, so I suggest you go to your own spaces for a little bit. Let's talk about what we can do to make the common space a healthier place for everybody where there's no fighting or you respect each other's spaces. And then we can talk about going to use it again." So that is perfectly logical. The research shows that in the event that there are consequences and outcomes, you can Google search, logical outcomes, consequences. The research shows that when there is a logical thread that connects what a misdeed to remediation, however you want to call it, a punishment, a consequence, an outcome, if there's a logical thread, the research shows that there's very little in the way of resentment. But if it's just about your rules and you're forcing something on the kids without explaining it to them, the research shows that there's very little learning from that. And quite to the contrary, it just builds a great deal of resentment. So I encourage you to think of it in those terms. In other words, if the kids, I'll give you a simple example. Our kids got licenses, driver's licenses when they were getting to that age. So one child in particular, cut the corner a few times. We had a catch basin on the corner of our home, on the street corner, and take a little shortcut and slash the sides of a couple of tires. So the first time we had a discussion about it. The second time, there was a consequence. They wouldn't get the keys back until, let's say, the tire was $100. So they had to do some chores for X number of dollars. I didn't make them pay for the whole thing, but my wife and I said that they would have to do some chores for a small portion of it, and if it happened again, it would be higher. So there was a logical outcome. You have a privilege. You're driving a car. You're being a little irresponsible. You didn't harm anybody. You didn't, God forbid, no life was in danger. But it was a level of irresponsibility. So pay for something. It's perfectly logical. So I think there should be discussions about consequences and outcomes, and have discussions with the kids about what brought about the poor choices that they made. And like I said, if there was a natural consequence, then stay with that. That's what I would encourage you to do. If there was a natural consequence where your child was very embarrassed by what happened, stick with that. Talk about it. What are your lessons? What are your takeaways? How can we stop it from happening again? So all of that is a discussion that's helpful. It gets the kids thinking. I think in tomorrow's parenting club, I'm discussing this issue today and tomorrow. This week was about what happened, plan B. What happened if something went wrong during Purim? If my memory serves, tomorrow's club actually talked about something that I did as the principal in the yeshiva, was that if the boys came to me, they got into a quarrel with a friend, they had an infraction, a teacher sent them to the office, for disciplinary action. So I didn't do this right away, but over the course of time, I started asking the kids. I would give them an index card when they came to me, and they would write down they would have to write down, that was my assignment to them, to write down 2 things they could have done from the time they walked into the building in the morning that would have avoided this from happening. Okay, so if a child comes to me and says, well, we got into an argument in class, a kid hit me in the back of my head while we were sitting, and I'd say, did you do anything to provoke it? Well, I kind of leaned back. So he leaned back, pushed over the kid's desk, so the kid shoved him back. So what could you have done? What it would sound like is the kid said, well, I pushed back too much. I really shouldn't have done that. I leaned back and I put my head on his desk. So that's a discussion that you have, and you talk about what they could do better in the future. So again, all of this is part of, I think, a healthy process where you discuss what they did wrong, how they came to that decision to make that, or lack thereof of not making a decision. Was there something that planning could have avoided it? And that, I think, is really a healthy way of doing this. It's perfectly fine to bring your child into the discussion of a consequence of, what would you think would be a reasonable consequence for what you did. And if it sounds out of the box, again, if you weren't raised this way, I certainly wasn't. My generation, I got a couple of years on most of you, but that type of thinking wasn't around then again. But the kids didn't have the access to information and freedom like today's children have, and environments are different. And we know that this authoritative type of parenting that I spoke about is really more helpful than just being authoritarian. So utilize it as a process where you go through helping your kids through their mistakes. That's my overall thinking on adolescence, is that adolescence is a time when children make mistakes in your home so that you can guide them through it. Okay, that's the big idea. And again, you're not doing them a favor if you say, all right, it's the first time, we'll just let it go. If it's something, if it was a serious infraction, there should be a consequence. Again, the consequence should be logical. It should be understood by the children, preferably derived at by a discussion about what they could do to avoid it from happening in the future. Another point I just want to mention, because we're talking about substance abuse and possibly, addictive behavior that may have started on Purim, if your child does have something that sounds like an addiction and it wasn't a one-off, then you might want to look into Al-Anon, which is, there are 12-step programs for addiction recovery for people who are addicted to free themselves of addiction and lead healthier lives. Along with that, there's a process, there's a support for parents or loved ones of people who are struggling with addiction. It's called Al-Anon. And the reason it's very helpful is because there's a concept called enabling behavior, way beyond the scope of this short live that I'm doing now. But I do think as parents, you should know about this information. You can Google search it. The big idea behind Al-Anon is that what we try to do is have parents be supportive of folks who are struggling with addiction, but not enable the behavior. That's the big idea. When I spoke to Dr. Abraham, speaking of mentoring, Dr. Abraham Tursky was very kind and mentored me a great deal almost 30 years ago when I started dealing in this space, which I had no training and no familiarity with. So whenever we spoke about addiction, virtually his first question is, who's the enabler? Who's helping the person get to addiction? Again, very quickly, just the big idea. The big idea is that an enabler, enable, which means just what it sounds like, meaning you facilitate inadvertently. You could facilitate someone's addiction. For example, let's say someone has a gambling addiction. Okay, so they go out and they go to they bet on sports, they bet on horse racing, they go on online betting or whatever it is. They go to casinos and they blow a couple of $1,000s. So at that point, they owe people money. They maxed out on their credit cards, let's say, right? And they had a consequence for their money, for losing that money and gambling the money away. Very often a loved one will say, all right, look, I'll settle up, I'll cover the debt this time, but this better not happen again. Okay? So what Al-Anon folks would say is that you just enabled $2,500 in betting because you covered the loss without paying to the person. So you're enabling their behavior. They figured out that for $2,500, they're not going to get busted. They can still get that. So then they'll just continue. It usually winds up, if we get into enabling behavior, again, people don't do it because they don't love it. Because sometimes we love the loved ones that we deal with who do struggle with addiction or addictive behavior. Sometimes people in their family or other loved ones try to bail them out a little bit and try to help them in a way that ultimately is really destructive. Again, one more thing on this, and then I'll look through questions quickly and we'll call it a night. I do have 2 more clips this week on this subject, so head over to Bright Beginnings Forum tonight to look up today's clip, and the next 2 days, tomorrow, Thursday, and the following day, Friday, where we're talking about how you can help your kids through this. One big idea about folks who are struggling with addiction is they have to hit rock bottom before they get better. That's the concept. Rock bottom is a really bad place, meaning that they come into terms with what their addictive behavior is causing, with their loved ones, with their job, with their own future. And then that rock bottom, it's a terrible place to be, where they lose everything and it breaks them and they have to go for help. They call it lowering the bottom, meaning what I said. Somebody gambles $2,500 and a loved one, instead of making them pay it back, even $10 a week, pay something back for what you gambled, we bail them out, but don't do it again. That's not what an addict hears. An addict hears that they're off the hook. So I just encourage you, if it is something that could be addictive behavior, please make sure that you're getting proper guidance. Speak to someone who's a specialist in recovery, a therapist, someone who works in this space, or you can look up the literature yourself to make sure that you don't get into that very unhealthy concept, but that we call enabling. Again, people who face consequences, natural consequences for what they've done, don't always have to get better, but it sort of forces a level of reflection upon them. Inadvertently, loved ones can remove that consequence, and that's why we call it enabling behavior. Let me look quickly. If anybody has any questions, please feel free to post them. If not, we'll call it a night. Again, I just wanted, one second, maybe thought behind consequences needs to be any type of fear that might deter them from reaching out. That's right. So that's the, again, opinion that what we spoke about, that the again, if it's a natural consequence, those are the best. Doesn't mean it's pleasant for the person, but if there is a natural consequence, the person who committed the misdeed, who did the addictive behavior, who got drunk, who did other things wrong, they have to pay a price for that. So in that case, that's what I mentioned in today's parenting club. Don't step on that message. Sometimes if a parent, if a loved one goes in and gives an added consequence, that becomes the focal point rather than the real consequence, which you want the focus to be on. So that's what I meant about not stepping on your message. But if there is no natural consequence, then it's up to parents or loved ones to see that there is a consequence for that. That's what we spoke about. Okay, so think about it. The more thought you give, the more you look online for resources, the more you approach it rather than a visceral reaction of you're punished, you're grounded. And grounded is important. If they did behavior that, again, if they didn't admit it, if they got caught and they wound up, getting into trouble or becoming unhealthy in an unhealthy situation, then you're doing the right thing by giving them a consequence. Again, we factor it in and then we act accordingly. Okay, thanks. I hope you found it helpful, everyone. Have a good night. 2 more clips on this subject, Thursday and Friday, over at Bright Beginnings Forum. Good night, everyone.